Hey internets, one of the things that exists underneath the libertarian right theory tent that often gets people really riled up is the libertarian nationalism question. Does it work? Is it extremely based? Or is it a contradictory ideology that makes no sense? And therefore the question becomes, can you even be a libertarian nationalist? Or is the very thing an oxymoron, like saying you're dry water or something? And what's really interesting about this question is that when you really get into it, it's one of those questions that has an interesting difference between the short answer and the long answer. Because the short answer is no, but the long answer is actually yes. You can be a libertarian nationalist. However, it comes with a lot of stipulations. And so before really getting into things, I'll just start with the short answer to make it easier to understand. Generally, in a colloquial sense in the way that the word nation is defined by your average everyday person, no, you can't really be a libertarian nationalist. In the way the average person views nationalism, the idea is that the state, the nation, and its people are all to be treated as one and the same, and thus the state's interest should be in that nation, while that nation also remains subservient to the state. Or as the Wikipedia-oids define it, nationalism is an ideology or movement that holds that the nation should be congruent with the state. And because of this, nationalism has a bit of a bad rap, as that kind of ideology is generally associated with people trying to use state aggression in order to force an identity upon the entire populace, whether they want it or not. And so really, the basic problem with this type of nationalism is that it commits a similar fallacy of the communists, collectivizing the populace under some kind of single will or collective mind, and then trying to assert ownership of that will. And the problem, of course, is that this will does not actually exist. That is a reification fallacy. At least it doesn't exist as a concretely real entity. And thus what actually happens under this form of nationalism is that the head of state ends up deciding that will, which is of course completely contradictory to libertarianism at the heart of its theory, property rights. If the head of state can simply decide that you don't have those rights, and of course with that will being defined by a non-productive and aggressive class, with the explanation given that it is for the will of the nation or whatever, then obviously you have a direct foundational contradiction. And under this view of libertarianism and nationalism and what those two things are, then of course you cannot be a libertarian nationalist. But as I said, this is an interesting one. There's a bit more to it than that. But before getting into the long answer, here's a shout out to this video's sponsor. The reality is, if you are not using a VPN these days, you are susceptible to having your data stolen by copyright trolls, government agencies, identity thieves, scammers, and hackers, all of whom are in the business of ripping you off or extorting you in one way or another. That's where this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access, comes into play. They keep your data safe by masking your connection through no-log RAM-only servers, and it should be emphasized that their no-logs policy has been proven several times in court and in various independent audits, thus keeping your data out of the hands of bad actors, whoever they may be. And in addition to data security and encryption, it also has some nice additional features like auto-blocking of known malicious domains used by ad trackers and malware. So it's also helpful towards keeping your system clean of viruses and other trashware you don't want. It's also by far the most stable VPN I've used, which is why it's been my go-to for years, and it's available on all devices, including Linux. But in addition to security, Private Internet Access also has servers all over the globe, meaning it can also be used to unlock geo-restricted features. Many websites limit your choices and shopping deals based on where you are located, and many streaming services like Prime Video, Netflix, Hulu, etc., they all restrict the movies and TV shows you can watch based on your location as well. And with this, you can switch your IP to whatever region you want, thus massively expanding your streaming library, all at a very low cost. Because Private Internet Access is also very affordable. If you use my link in the description or scan this QR code, you can get it now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, and with 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So there's really no reason not to give it a try. It's a good VPN. Anyways, now for what you're hopefully here for, which is the long answer. And the long answer begins to reveal itself when you take a look into the Journal of Libertarian Studies, which is a series of essays that were founded by Murray Rothbard, many of which are written by him. The one that specifically stands out here, which will show you why the long answer of can you be a libertarian nationalist, does national libertarianism make sense, why that answer is yes. Specifically, this essay, Nations by Consent, which is a relatively short essay on libertarian theory, but it might actually be one of the most important. And so while I am about to paraphrase a lot of it and explain it more for the modern day, I would recommend anybody who considers themselves a libertarian, or who is considering becoming a libertarian, or is just curious about what libertarianism actually is, this is kind of one of those must-reads. And so a link to the PDF will be in the description below. Don't worry, it's only 17 pages. But anyway, what makes it so important despite it being so short, with the main thing being that it proves and explains why the nation does not necessarily need to be the same thing as the state. And this isn't just a case of philosophers redefining things until it fits their ideas. Even looking at a simplified definition of nation from Oxford, it just says a country considered as a group of people with the same language, culture, and history who live in a particular area under one government. And remember, government is just the rules that an area lives under. It doesn't necessarily need to be a statist either. Or in other words, a nation doesn't necessarily need to have a non-consensual nature behind it. You can have an area of land owned and defined by rules where the people in that area are all of one culture, and it can still entirely exist under private property rights. And so thus the people who do not want to live under those rules and do not want to live under that culture, as long as they are free to leave, as long as there's some kind of freedom of association element in there, then you can thus have a nation without violating the NAP. If a social contract really is indeed voluntary, and is indeed something that a person can decide to not join or leave or terminate at will, then well, we're looking at something very different than what we're usually used to thinking of when we think of the idea of nationalism. And there is in fact in language a difference in this between what you call a nation and what you call a nation state, revealing that a mistake has been made in the last 50 years of discourse, where we who exist in the modern era have just kind of conflated these things to mean the same thing, when they are absolutely not. The main difference being that in the nation state, the state owns the nation, but in the nation as it is supposed to be defined, the nation is something that is comprised of those who voluntarily associate with it. And what most people don't notice is that this actually fixes a problem with nationalism, because how do you define what a culture is? How do you define what a society is? What even is a national identity? It is easy at first to assume that this is also a reification fallacy, or assume that these things are not concretely real. But that's not exactly true. Society absolutely does exist. If you were to pose the question, would you rather live in, say, Cordy Lane, or would you rather live in the slums of Somalia? Just about every sane person will choose the former. So society is a thing, even if it is difficult to define. It is a thing that people will willingly choose to be a part of or not be a part of. Or, as Rothbard writes, contemporary libertarians often assume mistakenly that individuals are bound to each other only by the nexus of market exchange. They forget that everyone is necessarily born into a family, a language, and a culture. Every person is born into one or several overlapping communities, usually including an ethnic group with specific values, cultures, religious beliefs, and traditions. And one thing I'd like to add to what's being said here is that you could prove this very easily with, again, just the age-old Islam is right about women question, or even just the fact that different languages exist. You cannot deny that there are similarities and differences between people that cannot be easily fixed. And because of this, the average person at least generally grows up with a preference for the society that they are born into. It's not always the case. Some people strike out on their own and find a different society or community to be a part of. But the point is, while there is no such thing as a collective mind, there is such thing as a shared social structure. And what's interesting about this is if you look into modern politics, you'll notice a lot of people being shamed for having this preference. One of the side effects of the post-World War II era is that people immediately associate this preference with, of course, the statist nationalism that we saw with Nazi Germany or with the USSR. And people wrongly associate these preferences with those regimes. And they don't realize that that is actually an association fallacy. One does not actually need to support these violent statist regimes in order to have a preference for one's culture. And you can really see this false association for what it is by just looking at the fact that it's not applied evenly. It's generally only applied to Western ethnicities, where you are deemed a lay racist bigot man for having a preference for Western culture, but never actually applied to what is deemed as minority cultures, even though technically Western culture and what you call Caucasian ethnicities are actually global minorities. And so you see really weird stuff where, say, African nationalism is considered politically correct, even though it is technically the same mentality. And what people don't realize is that there is a very simple answer to this, which is the importance of not forgetting the individual. Because the lib-lefts are correct, statist nationalism is definitely not actually good. In fact, statist nationalism can be said to suppress actual genuine nationalism by the consent of the people who are involved with it. On this, Rothbard writes, "It is now well known that the collapse of the centralizing and imperial Russian Soviet Union has lifted the lid on the dozens of previously suppressed nationalisms within the former USSR. The Russians, moving out from their Moscow center, forcibly incorporated many nationalities." And from this we can actually deduce the main logical blunder coming from the progressive left in the 2000s. They view minority nationalism as good and majority nationalism as bad because they refuse to recognize that the only real problem here is just the element of state aggression being used to try and forcibly integrate those who don't want to be integrated. And instead of blaming the state, they just blamed white people. The problem is white culture, white privilege, blah blah blah, etc., etc. When really the problem is all along the state choosing who associates with who, rather than allowing people to choose who they are going to associate with for themselves. Which just doesn't work because society is made up of a lot of complex elements. Aside from just social rules, religious beliefs, language, etc., etc. Rothbard also writes here, the question of nationality is made more complex by the interplay of objectively existing reality and subjective perceptions. Or in other words, even though society is a real thing, all of the individuals in that society are going to have a slightly different opinion of it. If you have one society that mirrors the golden age of the Victorian era, another society that focuses more on a cyberpunk aesthetic and tech bro mindset, well, you're going to have people who strongly prefer one or the other, but you also may have people who kind of want a little bit of both. You may even see people who want some kind of fusion, some kind of Victorian era technopunk community. And so because of this, in history, we've seen people expand and seen people merge cultures all the time. But the important element here to not forget, in order for libertarian nationalism to actually work and still be libertarian, is to not fall for the collective security fallacy. Because while society is a thing that people do interact with, the people who make it up are still individuals, and thus property rights still must necessarily be viewed from that angle. And so the collectivist element is again an actual flaw of state nationalism. And Rothbard goes into this in part 2 of his essay. Because there's a major problem that comes up when you try to compare enforcing property rights violations between individuals, say a cop or a private security force or whatever, preventing person B from stealing from person A, and then comparing that to these sort of collective claims of security, which states tend to make, which are often infused with collective guilt. Now, this part of Rothbard's essay on nations by consent sometimes tends to confuse people a little bit, because it's not really saying that there's no such thing as a security system that can help more than one person. That's not really what he's meaning by collective security. The problem here is what you can call the war pig mentality, and this is one of the stipulations on being an actual libertarian nationalist versus just kind of pretending to be a libertarian while having overwhelmingly statist nationalist views. So allow me to explain the problem in a different way. Victorian homes, Victorian streets, Victorian-era culture, Victorian-era books, and the church. All of these are real things, but none of them are actual people. They don't have a will, they're just stuff. Culture is ultimately just comprised mostly of just things that people make, from people who have some kind of shared background. But none of these things can aggress on somebody else's property rights. And so an issue with state nationalism is often people collectivize the idea of aggression. This idea that one state is aggressing on another state. But the thing is, if you look at history of wars, you'll realize that this isn't actually true. Nearly every single war involving state aggression is almost always the fault of really just a small number of psychopaths who've managed to worm their way into power, with the vast majority of the population of both states having absolutely nothing to do with it and no power to make decisions regarding the aggression whatsoever. Especially since the issue here is that these nation-states are without consent, mainly in the land they claim to own. Or, as Rothbard writes, the crucial flaw is the implicit assumption of the entire analysis, that every nation-state owns its entire geographical area in the same just and proper way that every individual property owner owns his person and the property that he has inherited, worked for, or gained in voluntary exchange. You see, the issue with states and how they own their land is that they don't really properly homestead that land. Rather, they make a claim to land that is based on aggression. For instance, if we were to restart the planet in a totally perfect ANCAP society, in a completely blank world, you would not be able to go, okay, 1, 2, 3, I point to all of these mountains and I hereby claim that I own these mountains. That's not how owning land works. You can't just be the first person to call it. You have to actually do something to land to make it yours. You have to show that you are necessarily utilizing that land, that you have turned it with labor and made it into something else, and also that that use is not infringing on anybody else's property rights. So for instance, you also wouldn't be able to walk around the planet and plant a single plank into the ground every mile or so and claim that you own all of that area either. It has to be genuine use. But the way that the state RICO aggression apparatus works, they don't really do that. The big problem with them is that they really do tend to just kind of point to a mountain range for hundreds of miles and claim that they own that place. And then they just back that ownership up with aggression. And so what you see is states have very large claims to land, along with claims to the people in that land, regardless of whether or not the people in those lands would actually want anything to do with the state. And you can see this pretty clearly in modern day wars in the Middle East. Like Iran, for example. Most people in the Iran conflict, they just are kinda there. Their government was violently taken over decades ago, and most of the Persian people were just kinda forced to go along with it. This makes war between nation states a lot more complicated, because people tend to think about it in the wrong way as a state versus a state. But as stated before, there's no collective will of the state. Within a nation, there is often a shared culture within that nation, but that's really it. The actual property rights being violated and the people involved are rarely as simple as wars paint them to be, and especially not as propagandists in the media tend to portray them as. Now, Rothbard, having wrote this essay back in the 90s, of course, gives an example from back then, the war in Bosnia. But then the counterexample, the refutation he gives, is an interesting logical argument that can be just as easily be used against many state wars. He wrote this: "Let us postulate two contiguous nation-states, Ruritania and Fredonia. Let us assume that Ruritania has suddenly invaded eastern Fredonia and claims it as its own. Must we automatically condemn Ruritania for its evil act of aggression against Fredonia and send troops, either literally or metaphorically, against the brutal Ruritanians and in behalf of brave little Fredonia? By no means. And here's the kicker, for it is very possible that, say, 2 years ago, eastern Fredonia had been part and parcel of Ruritania, was indeed western Ruritania, and that the Rurs, ethnic and national denizens of the land, have been crying out for the past 2 years against Fredonian oppression. In short, in international disputes in particular, in the immortal words of W.S. Gilbert, things are seldom what they seem, skim milk masquerades as cream. The beloved international cop, whether it be Boutros Ghali or United States troops or the New York Times editorialist, had best think more than twice before leaping into the fray." And the point here is that a lot of these wars, a lot of these conflicts are really just caused by the fact that current nations are not by consent. People who want to leave should be allowed to leave, especially again when you consider how the states don't even really homestead their land properly. They just kind of claim it and back it with aggression, even if other people had already been living in those areas that they claim for thousands of years prior, properly passing their property down from generation to generation to generation. And then state aggressors just come in and claim that they just own all the thousands of miles of mountains they can see. And then we're just supposed to take that seriously. And we can see part of this absurdity in the Russian and Ukraine war of today, which has a lot more nuance than I'm about to point out, but a lot of it really just does come from the Russian government wanting to say that Ukraine is rightful Russian clay, because it just is, because they just claim it. And so apparently they just own it, just because it was a part of the USSR before. And that's just kind of the absurdity of this anti-secessionist thinking. It is inherently an extremist bootlicker way of thinking. And so that's why a big stipulation on being a libertarian nationalist is understanding what these wars actually are, and why you should be skeptical of them. Anybody who jumps into supporting these wars without really thinking about it and not understanding it from the real property rights of individuals is not really a libertarian at all. That's just a nationalist. That's just a bootlicker. And he goes into this in part 3, rethinking secession. The issue being that not all state boundaries are just. And to add to that, it's honestly very rare for states to have properly homesteaded land. But the important thing here, and where libertarian nationalism does come into play, is the realization that this is a problem that can be fixed. Rothbard writes, "One goal for libertarians should be to transform existing nation-states into national entities whose boundaries could be called just." And what he means here kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about homesteading. The goal being a nation where all of the land of it actually has been properly acquired, rather than just simply pointed at and claimed, usually with violence to back it up. So for example, going back to Coeur d'Alene, if the people living there want to overwhelmingly secede from the Union and transform their city into one of these nations by consent, or a privatized city, with the boundaries set based on the land that they have actually justly acquired, then well, they should be allowed to do that. Or in the example Rothbard gives for the Fredonians and Ruritanians example of the eastern Fredonians, the inhabitants should be able to secede voluntarily from Fredonia and join their comrades in Ruritania. This idea that secession isn't actually a bad thing, what it really does is it gives a simple, peaceful resolution to these kind of conflicts that just sort of tend to naturally brew up when you have these major cultural conflicts where people overwhelmingly don't want to actually associate with a certain group of people based on those differences. And so it's a simple solution through freedom of association, and the result being more privatized borders, because the borders still do matter. As Rothbard further writes, national boundaries would still make a difference, often a big one, to the inhabitants of the area, for in what language, Fredonian or both, will be the street signs, telephone books, court proceedings, or school classes of the area. And so what's effectively being talked about here is allowing the existence of private nations based on already existing proper ownership of land to voluntarily secede and form their own covenant communities. And then for the people to effectively vote with their feet as to which community they want to be a part of, which people will naturally want to do. I mean, just ask yourself, if you have a choice between living in a city that speaks your language or one that doesn't, it's pretty obvious which one you'd want to move to. Or another example Rothbard gave, the Scots, if they want to, should be allowed by the English to leave the United Kingdom and to become independent and even join the Gaelic Confederation if the constituents so desire. And it really needs to be emphasized that these preferences that people have to live in a society that more closely matches the culture that they desire or the culture that they personally identify with, these preferences are entirely rational. Of course, the vast majority of people would rather live in a community that speaks their language, produces the kind of arts and entertainment they personally enjoy, or has the same virtues they believe in, and has laws and various contractual agreements based on those virtues, as well as having places nearby that support the kinds of social gatherings that they like, whether that be a fountain park for some or a church for others. And this just all further shines a light onto why the leftist open civilization pushers have been so ineffective. Their methods are based on the misguided belief that the state can simply shame these preferences out of people until we achieve some kind of mystical state of equality and peace, so long as the people just magically get along, which they then of course use to justify state-forced integration. And it hasn't worked. Just going back to the Islam is right about women question I went over earlier. How can their attempts to forcibly integrate those with a hippie free love mentality with those people who prefer a more traditional view of gender relations, how can that ever work when you remember that the people are not going to just? The people will not just stop having preferences for their own culture. And so it was always doomed to fail. One can just see the ridiculousness by just pushing the idea to its logical conclusion. Imagine a mosque teaching the most extreme conservative views of gender roles possible, sitting right next to a secular school having a drag queen story hour, teaching the kids that gender doesn't exist, that it's all a spook, a phantom, and that they can just make up whatever and be whatever. How can such two diametrically opposed ideologies exist in such close proximity within the same community? And the answer is it doesn't. And so it should come as no surprise then that this kind of forced integration actually just breeds social distrust. When people are not allowed to live in communities that share their virtues, that share their beliefs, that share their culture, then well, you don't actually know if the people you're interacting with share the same values as you. And that's a problem because that's what trust is built on. Hence, just another reason why people have these preferences to begin with. And so forced integration does not fix these problems, even if we just completely ignore the concept of libertarian ethics. Just as a model for a society, the forced multiculturalism just doesn't really work, even from a consequentialist perspective. Too many people just don't like it. And so the solution obviously is not forced integration, but also the solution isn't using the state to force segregation either, because if you look back in the Jim Crow era, that didn't work either. That just bred a different kind of resentment. Rather, the solution is to allow voluntary secession and voluntary separation, as opposed to forced integration or segregation. And that in essence is what a libertarian nationalist should be all about. And thus the long answer is yes, you can indeed be a libertarian nationalist, but it is a nationalist with this different kind of definition of nation in mind, which really is just the correct definition of nation that had been being used all along. It just got co-opted by ideologues who then smeared the ideas of nationalism, smeared these cultural preferences as being necessarily tied to the state aggression of, again, the violent regimes of the World War II era, when in fact the actual ideology behind it is completely different and does not require any association with those regimes, nor does it require apologizing for those regimes. It does not require defending what they did in any way, because this more correct ideology idea of what nationalism is has absolutely nothing to do with fascist or Nazi ideology. They're completely different. Which then kind of brings you to the next part of Rothbard's essay, where he talks about anarcho-capitalism. Or in other words, the libertarian nationalist mentality is really just another way of looking at private cities, as a model for a society that does not require any kind of state aggression in order for it to work and be an actual functional society, rather than the chaotic nonsense that is normally associated with anarchy by the normies. But it also raises an important point, because there are in fact some people out there who will call themselves libertarian nationalists, when in fact they are just standard GOP conservatives. And that's just incorrect, because in order for libertarian nationalism to work, in order for it to not be contradictory, well, a libertarian nationalist must necessarily be a radical libertarian. It must, in fact, be adjacent to anarcho-capitalist philosophy. Because if it isn't, then you're not really using the consent-based definition of a nation in order to fuel your idea of nationalism. And thus, the short answer as to why libertarian nationalism does not make sense ends up actually applying to you. TLDR, yes, you can be a libertarian nationalist, but you also have to be willing to reject the state in its entirety in order for this way of thinking to not contradict itself. And what's kind of interesting and kind of silly is that if you look at the Poll Comp Ball entry for this, which they list as national libertarianism, which you can also call libertarian nationalism, whichever way, which honestly national libertarianism might be a bit better to say just because it doesn't associate with the word nationalism. It does in fact come pretty close to working with the philosophy, like globalism violates the NAP here. Yes, it does. The driving force of globalism is open citizenship, that anybody can come in and enroll into socialist programs of a nation state, which is then paid for by the forcible extraction of resources, aka higher taxation, of the native population. That's pretty much a TLDR as to why globalism violates the NAP. There's other reasons, but that's the most obvious. But anyway, the wiki writes, unlike normal libertarianism, national libertarianism believes that nationalism is not mutually exclusive with liberty, but in fact required to attain what he terms the most realistic, sustainable level of liberty. National libertarianism believes that conflicts of interest caused by globalism and diversity leads to government tyranny. Some national libertarians think that the best way to prevent such is to break up existing nations into culturally homogenous states or nations. And so yeah, this does come pretty close enough to working. I would add nations by consent at the end of that sentence to emphasize the need to reject how the state claims its land and claims its jurisdiction and how it's inherently flawed. But luckily enough, it actually does link to nations by consent down at the bottom. So for something as silly as a Political Compass meme site, it's actually fairly close to the truth. It's really not bad. So you could also get a fairly good understanding of what it is and why it doesn't necessarily contradict libertarian philosophy by reading this as well. But also, again, I'd highly recommend fully reading Nations by Consent by Rothbard. It really isn't that long. I probably could have just straight read it and it would have been just as long as this video actually ended up being, going over it word for word. But anyway, the final question of this video is really just the question of strategy, which Rothbard does go into a bit towards the last part of his essay. Because one problem with ANCAP ideology isn't really a problem with the philosophy, but just a problem that it's completely disconnected from the way that society currently actually operates. And so when you give an ANCAP solution to a societal problem in the state of geopolitics as it currently exists in the current political climate we live in the year 2026, it can often come across as almost a utopian pie-in-the-sky idea, even if it's correct. It's just too difficult to reach because the solutions it offers don't really plug and play so well with the current system without first completely overthrowing that system, which sadly just isn't going to happen anytime soon. So what's the thing that anyone should focus on if they find themselves identifying with libertarian nationalism? And I think the main thing, the big focus, is just opposing open citizenship. One of the things I've realized about the open borders and closed borders debate is that it's a bit of a red herring from the real problem. Nobody actually cares if someone from another country visits another country on a tourism trip or something. The real problem happens when they want to settle down and gain citizenship in the nation state that they are trying to immigrate to, and thus gaining a whole bunch of rights and privileges that they have not actually paid for. They get free education, housing subsidies, free food, and sometimes even just direct cash payments and other welfare systems, as well as access to all of the infrastructure that has all been paid for by the native population, largely against their will. Then, of course, to add insult to injury, after a decade or so, then many of these Western societies, they gain the right to vote, which they then, of course, use to largely increase the state aggression in order to perpetuate the theft gravy train. And that's something I think that libertarians and sort of standard conservatives who kind of lean libertarian but don't really consider themselves anarcho-capitalists can actually largely agree on. For instance, again, talking about the current political climate we live in and looking at the state of things now, we can just look at the Trump administration and look at things like the SAVE Act and attempting to end birthright citizenship. The trash libs, the progressive leftists, the ones who are effectively for forced state integration, they are of course completely opposed to these two things. And the thing is, looking at this debate between them and the standard conservatives, honestly, the real problem is that the Trump conservatives aren't going hard enough. As long as we are stuck in a state democracy, both citizenship and voting shouldn't be seen as a right, but as a privilege that has to be earned. And so I will end this video with a recommendation that, in addition to reading Nations by Consent, everybody who's interested in libertarian nationalism should also go over to Mises Media, because they've been talking about this a bit more openly for the past year or so, going in a lot more in depth as to why citizenship isn't something that you can just grant willy-nilly. Why it's not only something that should not be seen as a right, but rather viewing it as a right is actually a contradiction in and itself, because that actually necessarily contradicts actual, real, natural rights. But anyway, for now, that is all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, becoming a member of the channel, which, by the way, either of those two gets you priority in my QA videos, or by checking out the sponsor of this video, Private Internet Access. But anyways, again, that is all. Thanks for watching. Till next time.